While remaining neutral in the Second World War, Portugal helped the Allies out just a little more than they did the Axis, and without Portugal's passive contributions to the Allies, especially Britain and the US, the war might have played out quite a bit differently. It's sometimes easy to forget the subtler political and positional maneuvers of war when they're drowned out by the rolling of tanks and exploding of shell fire, though that doesn't mean they're any less important than how many soldiers one side brings to a fight and how many enemy soldiers they manage to kill in that fight. Also, Portugal's more direct contributions to the betterment of humanity were nothing small, and they were especially welcome given the beating humanity was taking elsewhere in Europe. In this video, we're going to outline Portugal's contributions to World War II despite its unyielding stance as neutral. Portugal's neutrality in itself was of great significance to the war, and despite the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1373, the near 650-year-old alliance between England and Portugal, which basically says they've got each other's backs, Britain agreed. While there were other reasons for Portugal's neutrality, its dictator, but not a dictator, António de Oliveira Salazar's logic regarding Portugal's Iberian neighbour, Spain, was sound. While he feared communism breaking its way into Portugal, and while nationalist Spain was the shield against that, Salazar Slytherin was also concerned that Spain would strengthen their ties with the Axis and become a threat. So, around 6 months before Germany invaded Poland and World War II commenced, and also just at the end of the Spanish Civil War, a pact between Portugal and Spain was signed. This was the Iberian Pact, and among other things, it basically stated that the two countries must band together to resist attacks on the Iberian Peninsula and keep Iberia neutral despite any sort of war in Europe. Spain becoming Axis allied was now out of the picture, and Britain had absolutely no problem at all letting Portugal sit this one out, unless it came to it that Britain absolutely needed them. If things hadn't played out this way, it may have been a nightmare for Portugal and the Allied war effort. The Axis could have theoretically stormed through Spain, sweeping up Spaniards on the way, crushing Portugal into the North Atlantic, and then sundering the bulwark of Gibraltar before blasting into North Africa and obliterating the North African campaign. The British ambassador in Lisbon at the time, Sir Ronald Campbell, wrote, "If Portugal's neutrality, instead of being strict, had been more benevolent in the Allies' favour, Spain would inevitably have thrown herself body and soul into the arms of Germany. The peninsula would have been occupied, and then North Africa. The whole course of the war would have been altered to the advantage of the Axis." This was a bold move by Salazar. Remaining neutral, as history tells, is in many ways harder than picking a side and fixing bayonets. So before we outline some of Portugal's other contributions to the war, which in themselves put tremendous strain on the country's neutrality, let's divvy out some tungsten. As per Portugal's neutrality, it had to, well, remain neutral. Sort of. This extended beyond actual fighting to trade, of course, and one of the most important goods Portugal had in abundance was wolfram or tungsten, which was crucial in the production of war munitions. Basically, both Britain and Germany wanted it, and Portugal wanted to keep reeling in bank while also avoiding Hitler's wrath. So what Portugal did was sell Germany the same amount of tungsten they sold Britain, maintaining a balance of supply. Though, thankfully, Portugal made Germany pay up front as opposed to Britain, which was allowed to run up a hefty tab. Nearing Operation Overlord, the Allies politely asked Portugal to stop supplying the Germans with tungsten, and this, of course, put Portugal in a pretty sticky situation. Eager to keep their gold neutral star, Portugal halted all tungsten exports to both the Axis and the Allies, putting many of their own people out of work. It's worth noting, Portugal also traded other goods to both sides, such as rubber and sugar. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought from the first year of the war to the last year, and as it was primarily a naval battle, those few spits of land between the Americas and Europe and Africa were hot real estate. Among those few spits of land are the Azores, a chain of volcanic islands off the west coast and a part of Portugal. Both Britain and the US wanted the Azores so badly they even devised plans, deemed Operation Alacrity and War Plan Grey, to snatch it from Portugal without Portugal's approval. Luckily, neither of these powerhouses needed to cross that line, for somehow, Portugal was able to remain neutral, at least on paper, even after leasing the Azorean air bases to the British in August 1943. Britain, however, took their cashing in on the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1373 a step further, persuading Portugal to let the US set up some air bases there too. For every pascal of pressure this put on Portugal's neutrality, 10 times as many were released from the war, as granting the Allies this position allowed them to turn the Battle of the Atlantic in their favour. To put it in perspective, over 1,900 US aircraft passed through the airbase Lajes Field on the Azorean island Terceira from late 1943 to mid-1944 alone, cutting their transit time from Brazil to Africa in half. Now, when I spoke about Portugal's contributions to the betterment of humanity, I was talking about how Portugal and its island Madeira became safe havens for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the war-torn countries of, and trying to altogether flee, Europe in the Second World War. In July 1940, around 2,500 Gibraltarians were evacuated from Gibraltar in anticipation of an Axis attack on the British overseas territory. These people, mostly women and children, were shipped to Madeira. The rest of those who found refuge in or passed through Portugal, primarily its capital Lisbon, were from all over Europe. Many were French, Polish, Dutch, and Belgian military refugees, and many more were Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Of those who left Europe altogether, many went to the United States. The sacrifice of Portuguese Consul General Aristejas de Sousa Mendes and other heroes like him are to thank for much of what happened in Lisbon, though that's worthy of at least its own video. To put it in perspective though, Sousa Mendes is recognized as Portugal's Schindler. Anyway, to put it simply, Portugal was a beacon of hope during World War II, when humanity needed every bit of hope that it could get. With Portugal favouring Britain in tungsten trade, lending the Azores to the Allies and taking refugees, which included military refugees from all over Europe, you may be thinking that Portugal wasn't all that neutral in the Second World War. They certainly leaned just a little more toward the Allies on the whole. There were outliers, however, with some 159 Portuguese volunteering to join the Axis in the war just so they could fight the communists. These men fell in with their Iberian counterparts under the Blue Division, which was a Spanish volunteer and conscript unit under the German Heer. And don't think the Axis were oblivious to Portugal's neutrality either. The Germans, under Operation Felix, had sketched up a plan to invade Portugal and Madeira and the Azores, though it never came to fruition. There was also Operation Isabella, in which, after destroying the Soviet Union, the Germans had laid out a concept to take Iberia and use it as a stage from which they could slowly kill Britain. So, how did all this dangerous neutrality work out for Portugal? Well, the gamble paid off and it worked out rather well. Portugal not only survived the most devastating war in human history, but came out richer because of it. Salazar himself, a dictator everywhere but on paper, earned praise from Britain and America alike, with British diplomat Sir George Rendell stating that the former Portuguese Republican government was far more difficult to deal with as an ally during the First World War than the infinitely better government of Salazar was as a neutral in the Second. Regardless of what Portugal's alignment was on paper, it did the Allies and humanity a great deal of good throughout the Second World War, and it's one of those countries whose contributions deserve more attention than they get. So, what are your thoughts? Were Portugal's contributions to World War II those of a neutral nation? Were there any contributions that you think should have taken priority in this video? Also, would you like to see a video on the Portugal's Schindler that we mentioned earlier? Let us know in the comments section below. Also guys, just before you go, make sure you check out the links in the description below. We have our front Discord link where you can chat with other history buffs, and we have the Patreon if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching these videos. If you do decide to donate, you get access to a special behind the scenes Discord where you see just how we work and you can give us recommendations and all that fun stuff. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.